Welcome to Late Night Calm. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears and let the day you have just lived begin to loosen its grip, one finger at a time. There is nowhere you need to be now and nothing you need to solve. Tonight we are going to travel a long way, slowly, and you do not have to stay awake to arrive. You can drift off at any point along the road, and the road will keep going without you, carrying you gently down into sleep. Tonight, we are going to climb a ladder. Not a real one, made of wood and rope, but an invisible one made of glances and gloves and the angle of a bow. We are going to walk up, rung by rung, through the whole of Victorian society from the very bottom to the very top, and we are going to ask a quiet question at each step. What would your life actually have been like here on this rung? What would you eat? Where would you sleep? What would you fear in the small hours of the night? And strangest of all, what tiny thing would have given you away, the way a single wrong word at dinner could betray a man to the people watching him? Because that is the secret of this whole world, and it is the thing almost nobody tells you. The Victorian class system was not a vague slope from rich down to poor. The way we tend to imagine it now, a gentle hill with comfortable people near the top and struggling people near the bottom. It was a precision instrument. It was calibrated by objects, by words, by doorways, by the hour you ate your meals and the name you gave them, by the depth and the duration of a bow. The gap between one rung and the next could be almost invisible to a modern eye, and yet it was policed ferociously by the very people living inside it. And here is the part that surprises everyone, so let me plant it now, gently, like a seed, and we will come back to water it much later in the night. There was a single object, a small and ordinary thing that cost almost nothing, and yet it stood as the entire dividing line between a starving man and a well-fed man, between respectability and ruin. A man would go hungry, genuinely hungry, before he would be seen without it. Hold that quietly in your mind as we walk. We will return to it. And there is more I want you to carry with you loosely, the way you might carry a smooth stone in a pocket. There was a single word spoken at the wrong hour of the day that could expose a person's class instantly, before they had said anything else at all. There was a real paid trade in the streets of London that involved gathering dog mess by hand, and somebody, somewhere, actually bought it. And there was a single government survey taken in 1 year that revealed that a tiny handful of families owned a share of all the land in Britain, so large it would, even now, stop you in your tracks. We will come to all of these. There is no hurry. We have all night. But first, the most important truth of the whole journey, the one that turns everything else upside down. You might assume, quite reasonably, that the most frightened people in Victorian England were the poorest, the ones at the very bottom, with the least. And yet it was not so. The people who lay awake at night, sick with anxiety about their position, were not the destitute. They were the ones a little way up the ladder in the thin and crowded band just above the working class, the people with the most to lose and the smallest margin to lose it by. The terror that governed nearly every household, from the workhouse gate to the manor door, was not the fear of being poor. It was the fear of slipping, of sliding down just one rung into the place you had spent your whole life clawing away from. So that is our companion for the night. Not greed, not even hunger, though we will meet hunger soon enough. The quiet, gnawing terror of falling one step. Keep it beside you as we descend, because before we can climb, we must go all the way down. Down to the very bottom of the ladder, to the rung beneath which there was nothing at all but the cold ground. Down to the pauper and the workhouse. Let me set the scene for you slowly. Imagine a building. It is large and it is plain, and it is built of brick the colour of a bruise. It sits often at the edge of a town, a little apart, the way you might keep something you did not quite want to look at directly. It has high windows set too far up the wall to see out of, and a wall around it, and a gate. And above that gate, in the cold logic of the age, hung an idea, not a sign you could read, but an idea stitched into every brick of the place. The idea was this: that whatever happened inside these walls must be made worse, deliberately worse, than the hardest life a free and independent poor man could scrape together on the outside. They had a name for it. They called it less eligibility. Less eligible, meaning that the workhouse must always be the less desirable choice, so that no one would ever choose it unless they were truly at the absolute end of everything they had. It came from a law, the Poor Law Amendment Act, passed in the year 1834. And the reasoning behind it was as cold and as clear as ice on a window pane. If relief for the poor were made too kind, too comfortable, then surely the lawmakers thought the idle and the feckless would flood in, would choose ease over honest labour. So the cure was cruelty by design. Make the refuge harsher than the storm, and only those genuinely drowning would come in out of the rain. Think about that for a moment gently before we go through the gate. Not cruelty by accident, not neglect, not an oversight, not a thing that slipped through the cracks. Cruelty as the plan. The suffering inside was the mechanism, the very engine of the thing, and that is the cold heart at the bottom of this whole ladder we are about to climb. So you arrive. Perhaps you are a widow whose husband has died and left you nothing. Perhaps you are an old man whose hands can no longer do the work that fed you. Perhaps you are a whole family, a mother and a father and their children, who have run out of every other door to knock on. You have heard the phrase that people used, spoken low, with shame in the voice, going on the parish. To go on the parish meant to accept the relief, to become a charge upon the place, and it carried a deep and particular disgrace, the kind that clung to a name for a generation. People delayed it as long as their bodies could bear, selling first the furniture, then the bedding, then the very clothes off their backs, because to go on the parish was to admit, publicly, that you had failed at the one thing the age demanded above all others, which was to stand on your own 2 feet. But say you have run out of everything and there is no choice left, you come to the gate with whatever family remains to you, and you go in. And here, at the very threshold, comes the first wound, and it is a deep one, because the family that walked in together does not stay together. At the door, you are separated by sex and by age. The husband to one ward, the wife to another. The older children taken from the younger. The man who has slept beside the same woman for 30 years, who has raised children with her, buried children with her, is led away to a separate part of the building, and from that moment they may not be together. And it was not a thing softened in practice. To attempt to speak to your own spouse across that divide, to try to pass a word or a touch through the rules, could be punished. The marriage did not dissolve in the eyes of the law, but the life of the marriage, the small daily warmth of another person beside you, was simply taken away at the door like a coat and stored somewhere you could not reach. And speaking of coats, your own clothes, the clothes you walked in wearing, are taken from you too, stripped off and stored, and you are given in their place a uniform. Coarse cloth, the same for everyone, rough against the skin, designed for durability and for sameness, never for comfort and never for dignity. Your own clothes are kept, folded away in a store, and they will be given back to you only on the day you leave, if you ever leave. so that the moment you stepped inside, you stepped out of your own self and into a number. The thing you wore, your one small flag of who you were in the world, was taken at the door and held hostage until you walked back out the gate. And then there is the food. Let us talk slowly about the food, because few things tell you more about a life than what is set in front of a person to eat. The diet inside the workhouse was not a matter of a cook deciding what to make. It was governed by tables, dietary tables, printed and fixed, that laid out by weight and by measure exactly what each inmate would receive on each day at each meal. And the foundation of it, the daily bread of the place in the most literal sense, was gruel. Now, gruel is a thin thing. It is oatmeal stirred into water, and that is very nearly all it is, a pale, watery porridge with little to it but the warmth of the water itself. Bread weighed out. Cheese, a small portion. Occasionally, on certain days, a measure of meat, or a broth with something of meat in it, but measured, always measured, never more than the table allowed. You may know somewhere in the back of your mind the image of a small boy holding up an empty bowl and asking, "Please, sir, I want some more." That moment, written by Dickens, was not invented out of nothing. It reflected a real discipline of rations, a real world in which the amount of food was a fixed and rationed thing, and to ask for more than your portion was not a small request, but an act, a transgression, a crack in the order of the place. The hunger was not incidental. The hunger, like everything else, was part of the design. Less eligible, remember. The food had to be worse than the food of the poorest free labourer outside, and the poorest free labourer outside was often hungry indeed. And then, of course, there was the work. Because you did not lie idle in the workhouse. The relief was not given as a gift, it was wrung out of you in labour, and the labour was chosen often precisely because it was hard and dull and crushing. There was oakum picking. Let me explain what that was, because the word means nothing to us now. Old ship's rope, when it had been used and tarred, and was no longer fit for the sea, was brought into the workhouse in great stiff coils, hard and black and matted with old tar. And your task was to pick it apart, to take that hard old rope in your hands and tease it, fibre by fibre, back into loose strands, working the tar out of it with your fingers until your fingers were raw and split and bled into the work. The picked fibre, the oakum, was not wasted. It was sold to the shipyards, where it was packed into the seams between the planks of a ship's hull to make them watertight, so that, in a strange and bitter circle, the hands of the desperate poor caulked the ships that carried the wealth of the empire across the sea. There was stone breaking, great lumps of stone, and a hammer, and the task of breaking them down to a certain size, hour upon hour, the jarring of the blow travelling up the arm and into the shoulder, the dust rising in the cold air. And there was bone crushing, which brings us to the darkest single moment of all, and I will tell it to you gently, because the night is for calm. And this is a thing that happened to real people, in a real place, and it should be remembered, but it should not be made into a horror for its own sake. It is here because it shows you more clearly than any law what the bottom of this ladder truly was. The place was Andover, in the south of England. The year was around 1845. The task given to the inmates there was bone crushing. Old bones brought in to be crushed down for use as fertiliser to spread on the fields. And the men set to crush those bones were so hungry, so deeply and continuously hungry, that they were found gnawing at the bones themselves, sucking and gnawing at the rotten marrow, and the gristle still clinging to the old bones they had been set to break. It came out, it was not hidden forever. There followed an inquiry, a parliamentary investigation, men in a committee room turning over the question of how it could have come to this, how a system meant to relieve the poor had brought men to gnaw at bones meant for the soil. The scandal of Andover became a name people knew, a watchword for what the workhouse could become when the cold logic of less eligibility was followed to its end. And I tell you this not to disturb your rest, but so that, as we climb up and away from here into warmer rooms and softer beds, you will remember what lay at the foot of the ladder, so that the rest of the journey carries its proper weight. Breathe slowly now, we are nearly done with the very bottom, and there is comfort coming, a little way up. There was one more dread that haunted the poorest, beyond the workhouse itself, beyond the gruel and the oakum and the split families. It waited at the very end of life, and its name was the pauper's funeral. To die a pauper meant to be buried at the expense of the parish with no stone, no marker, no name above the ground, lowered into a common grave, shared with strangers, in a plot that no one would tend and no one could find again. And for people who had almost nothing in life, this final indignity, this erasure even from the memory of the earth, was a particular terror. To save against it, to keep back a few coins week after week against the cost of a decent burial, was for many of the respectable poor the most sacred saving of all, more important than food, because to be buried as a pauper was to confess with your own bones that you had lost everything, right down to your name. And not everyone who fell to the bottom even reached the workhouse proper. There were those who drifted, who walked the roads from town to town looking for work, or for nothing at all, the tramps and the homeless wanderers. For them, there was the casual ward, known in their own rough speech as the spike, a place where a wandering man or woman could come in for a single night, be given a bed and a little food in exchange for a task to be done. And the bed itself tells you what kind of welcome it was. Sometimes it was a wooden box, narrow and shaped, people said, like a coffin. Sometimes a hammock slung in a row of hammocks. And the price of the night, the task you had to perform before they would let you back out into the morning, might be a quota of stone to break, a set amount, measured and required, so that even the one night's shelter was paid for in labour with the body. That is the bottom of the ladder, the pauper and the workhouse and the spike beneath even that. The split family at the door, the coarse uniform, the table of gruel, the rope and the stone and the bone, the dread of the unmarked grave. A whole world built deliberately to be the place no one would choose unless every other place had already closed its door. And now, very gently, we begin to climb. Because just above the workhouse, out in the streets and along the river, and down in the dark beneath the city, there was a whole crowded layer of people who were poor, often desperately poor, but who were free, who had not gone on the parish, who had not yet come to the gate. People who lived by their wits and their hands and their willingness to do the work that no one else would touch. The labourers, the casual poor, the street folk of a great and roaring city, scraping a living from the very gutters and the river mud and the sewers, holding on to the one precious thing the workhouse would have taken from them, which was that they were still their own. And we have a guide for this layer, a real man who walked these streets and wrote down what he saw, and we will follow him in a moment, down to the edge of the river at low tide, where the children and the old went looking for treasure in the mud. But for now, let yourself rest here at the foot of the ladder, where we have stood together in the cold a while. Let the workhouse fade behind you. You do not have to go back through that gate. You are only passing, only listening, drifting upward and away. There is so much more ladder above us, so many more rooms to look into, so many quiet, strange, human details still waiting in the dark ahead. The collar that meant everything. The word that gave a man away. The trade in the gutters and the families who owned half a nation. We will reach them all slowly, in their turn, but none of it has to keep you awake. Let the climb carry you the way a slow tide carries a small boat, lifting it without effort, without sound. You are safe and warm, and there is nothing left to do now but listen and breathe and let yourself begin to sink towards sleep, down through the quiet, while the long road keeps unwinding gently into the night. But before we climb, we have to begin where the ladder rests against the cold ground, and to understand the bottom rung, you first have to understand the single thread that ran through every single life on this ladder, from the man in the gutter to the duke in his great house. That thread was a thin one. It was made of linen, and it sat around a man's neck, and it was called a collar. It sounds like nothing, a scrap of starched cloth, clean and white, fastened beneath the chin. And yet that collar was the most important object a certain kind of man owned, because it told the world at a single glance that he did not work with his hands. A workman, however skilled, however well paid, wore a neckerchief or an open shirt or nothing at all at the throat, because a collar would have been ruined in an hour by sweat and coal and labour. But the clerk, the man who sat at a high desk and moved a pen across a ledger all day, kept his collar clean and white and stiff, and that whiteness was his whole identity. It is where we still get the words, even now, more than a century on. White collar work. The collar that meant you were clean. And here is the strange, sad heart of it, the thing that runs underneath this entire long night. A clerk and a skilled artisan might take home almost exactly the same wage at the end of the week, the same coins, the same shillings, counted out into the same kind of tired palm. And yet they would never, ever have thought of themselves as the same. The artisan was a working man and proud of it, but the clerk would rather have gone hungry, would rather have eaten less, and worn his one coat thinner and gone without, than be mistaken for a man who worked with his hands. He would starve a little, quietly, genteelly, to keep that collar clean, because the collar was the line, and on this side of the line you were respectable, and on the other side you were not. Hold on to that gently as we go down, because the fear that kept that collar white, the terror of slipping from one side of an invisible line to the other, was not the fear of the people at the very bottom of this ladder. Those at the bottom had already slipped as far as a person could slip. No, the greatest fear lived a little higher up, in the precarious houses just above the working poor, where a single bad month could send you tumbling. We will come back to that fear again and again tonight, because it is the engine of the whole machine. But to feel it properly, you first have to see what waited at the very bottom, in the place that everyone, on every rung, was so terrified of falling into. So let us go all the way down now. Down past the labourers we have just spoken of, down past the casual poor who still slept in their own rented corner of a room, all the way to the floor, to the place where you had nothing left at all, to the pauper and the gate of the workhouse. To enter the workhouse was to accept what they called going on the parish, to say out loud to the officials of your own town that you could no longer keep yourself alive by your own efforts, and that you were throwing yourself upon the mercy of the poor relief. And the shame of those words sat so heavily on the respectable poor that many of them chose to starve quietly in their own homes rather than say them. They would sooner waste away in private than walk through that gate in front of their neighbours. And the men who built the system wanted it that way. This is the part that is hardest to forgive, and it is worth understanding slowly, in the dark, where the cold logic of it can be seen plainly. In the year 1834, a law was passed, the Poor Law Amendment Act, and it was built upon a single, deliberate, icy principle. They called it less eligibility. And what it meant was this: life inside the workhouse had to be made worse, on purpose, than the life of the very poorest free labourer outside it. Worse food, worse work, worse comfort. It had to be more wretched than the most wretched independent life a person could possibly cling to, because if the workhouse were anything other than miserable, the reasoning went the poor might actually want to come in. And so misery itself became the policy. The cruelty was not an accident or a failing, it was the design. And so picture the gate. Picture yourself walking up to it on the worst day of your life, with whatever family you had left. And the first thing they did to you at the very threshold was take that family apart. Husbands were sent one way, wives another. The children above a certain age were taken from their mothers and housed in their own wards. A man and his wife of 30 years could be marched into the same building and then never permitted to speak to one another again, separated by sex and by age into different wings and punished, actually punished, if they tried to find each other or pass a word across the divide. You came in as a family and you were unmade at the door. Then they took your clothes. Whatever you had worn in, however poor, was stripped from you, folded, stored away, to be handed back only if you ever left. And in its place you were given the uniform, a coarse, scratching, shapeless cloth that marked you instantly as a pauper, as a person who belonged to the parish now, the same as everyone else inside those walls. And then they fed you, if you can call it feeding. The food was not cooked by feeling or by hunger. It was governed by a thing called the dietary tables, fixed lists that decided by the ounce and by the weight exactly how much each inmate would receive. Gruel, which was little more than oatmeal stirred into water, thin and grey and warm at best. Bread, a small ration of cheese, now and then a little meat, a little broth. Measured out, weighed, never quite enough. When the boy in the famous story stands up with his empty bowl and asks, "Please, sir, I want some more," he is not inventing a horror. He is describing the real arithmetic of the workhouse, where the ration was the ration, and to ask for more was to break the rules of the place itself. And in return for that gruel and that bread, you worked, not work that built anything for you, not work that earned you a wage you could keep. Work designed to be hard and dull and endless. Work whose true purpose was to make sure you never grew comfortable. The women and the old men were set to picking oakum, which meant taking lengths of old ship's rope, stiff and black and tarred, and unpicking them by hand, fibre by fibre, teasing the rope back apart until your fingers were raw and split and bleeding, hour upon hour, so that the loosened fibre could be sold off to the shipyards to be packed between the planks of boats. The stronger men broke stone, swinging away at it until a set quota of it was small enough. And some of them were set to a task grimmer still. They were set to crushing old bones to be ground down and sold for fertiliser. And it is at this last task that the whole dark logic of less eligibility shows its true face, in a real place, in a real year. The workhouse at Andover in the years 1845 and 46. The men there were set to crushing bones, as in so many other places. But the food at Andover was so meagre, the hunger so constant, and so deep that something was discovered which shocked even a country that had grown used to averting its eyes. The men crushing the old bones were found gnawing at them, scraping with their teeth at the rotten marrow and the scraps of gristle still clinging to those decaying bones, because the system that fed them had left them hungry enough to do it. And when word of this got out, there was an inquiry and a parliamentary investigation and a small storm of national shame. But the principle that had produced it, the deliberate designed misery of less eligibility, The rule that the inside must always be worse than the outside, that principle remained. This is what waited at the bottom of the ladder. This is what every rung above it was, in some quiet corner of the mind, afraid of. And the fear followed you even past the gate, even into death, because to die in the workhouse, or to die too poor to be buried by your own people, was to be given a pauper's funeral, laid in a common, unmarked grave, with no stone, no name, nothing to say you had ever lived at all. And the dread of that ending, the dread of vanishing into the ground without a trace, haunted the respectable poor more than almost anything. And below even the long-term inmate, there was one rung lower still for those who had not even a workhouse place to call their own. The wanderers, the tramps moving from town to town, who came at dusk to a thing called the casual ward, which the men who slept in them called the spike. There you might be given a single night's shelter and a little food in exchange for a task to be completed before they would let you leave again in the morning. And the bed you were given for that night was sometimes no bed at all, but a narrow wooden box shaped, if you let yourself see it, unsettlingly like a coffin. But you are not in that box. You are warm, and you are safe. And you are only listening from a great and gentle distance, looking down into the past from somewhere soft and far away. We have stood at the very bottom now. We have seen the floor of it. And there is nowhere to go from here but up, slowly, through the long quiet of the night, toward the strange and human rungs still waiting above. The first rung above the workhouse was not in truth a great distance from it, not in miles, not in money, and not in the daily condition of the body. But it was a distance that mattered enormously to the people living it, because it was the difference between dependency and a threadbare, precarious kind of freedom. The labouring poor, the men and women and children who made their livings in the streets and the rivers and the docks of Victorian England, were free in the sense that they had not submitted themselves to the institutions of the poor law. They had not been separated from their families at an admission desk, had not traded their own clothes for a rough institutional uniform, had not eaten their measured weight of bread at a table they had no choice in sitting at. They worked for themselves after a fashion, or they worked for whoever would hire them that day. And that sliver of independence, as that freedom to go hungry on one's own terms rather than on the parish's terms, was worth protecting at enormous cost to themselves. A man named Henry Mayhew spent a great part of his working life in the 1840s and early 1850s walking into places that respectable London preferred not to think about, sitting down with the people he found there and writing down what they told him. The result was a work called London Labour and the London Poor, published in 1851, and it is one of the most astonishing documents the Victorian era produced. Not because Mayhew was a social reformer with a programme or a politician with a remedy, but because he was, more than almost anything else, a listener. He wrote down what the street said in their own voices with their own particulars, and what he recorded was a world of such extraordinary ingenuity and such ordinary suffering that it is almost impossible to read without the sense of being pulled gently under the surface of the official city and into the true one moving beneath it. The street folk of London were sorted by Mayhew into categories so precise they read like the taxonomy of a naturalist. There were costermongers, who were perhaps the most numerous, the men and women who sold fruit and fish and vegetables from barrows and baskets in the street, calling their wares in voices trained to carry over the noise of the city. A costermonger's life was governed by weather and by credit and by the mood of the morning market, where goods were bought before dawn and then carried out to wherever customers might be found. A good day was one where the stock sold before it spoiled, and a small profit was cleared after the cost of the barrow and the market fees were paid. A bad day was one where it rained and the customers stayed inside, and the unsold goods rotted in the basket, and the debt carried forward into tomorrow, and many days were bad days. Then there were the mudlarks. The word itself has a kind of romantic sound to it, but the reality it described was something else entirely. Mudlarks were the people, and they were very often children, and they were very often very old, who made their living on the foreshore of the Thames at low tide, wading through the cold grey mud, searching for anything that could be sold. A piece of coal, fallen from a barge, a length of rope that had drifted loose, a nail, a scrap of iron, a fragment of copper. A mudlark's takings on a good day might be a few pence. On a poor day, nothing but muddy hands and cold feet and the long walk home in wet clothes. And they came back the next tide, and the tide after that, because there was nothing else. The Thames was London's highway, and its sewer, and its dustbin all at once, and what the city dropped or discharged or discarded, the mudlarks retrieved and sold back into the city in some altered form. And so the long impoverished cycle continued. And then there were the pure finders. Now here is the trade promised earlier, the one that would make you pause. A pure finder was a person, usually a woman of middle age or older, who collected dog excrement from the streets of London. She moved through the city with a bucket and a glove, gathering the material wherever she found it, and then she sold it, by the bucket or by weight, to the men who ran London's tanneries. In the tanning of fine leather, the kind used for gloves and bookbindings and the softer grades of shoe leather, the hides were treated with a substance that the tanners called pure, and pure was exactly that. The ammonia and the enzymes in dried dog excrement served to purify the animal's skin, to remove the last traces of animal matter, and to bring the leather to the soft, supple quality that the luxury market required. A pure finder who knew the streets well and was willing to work long hours might collect enough to earn something in the range of shillings a week, which placed her, in Mayhew's reckoning, among the more regularly employed of the street folk. There was no disgrace in it, or none that the trade itself recognized. It was a trade with its own market, its own buyers, its own professional knowledge of where the best pickings were to be found. And fine leather gloves were worn by ladies in drawing rooms by women who had no idea and would never wish to think what had been part of making them. Below even the mudlarks and the pure finders, in terms of the physical conditions in which the work was done, were the toshers. A tosher went where no one who could avoid it would willingly go. Into the sewer network beneath London, those brick tunnels running under the streets and carrying the city's waste toward the river. The sewer was not merely unpleasant, it was genuinely dangerous. A tosher moved through the tunnels, bent almost double in the narrower passages, feeling along the floor with a long pole, searching for dropped coins, for metal fittings, for anything of value that had washed down from the city above. The methane gas that accumulated in the tunnels could knock a man unconscious without any warning at all. The tides in the sewers connected to the Thames could flood a passage faster than a man could run. The rats were enormous and, in sufficient numbers, willing to attack. And yet men went into the sewers because there were coins down there, real coins that had slipped through gratings and drains, and enough of them to make the risk worth taking, at least in the calculation of a man who had very few other calculations open to him. The toshing trade was technically illegal, which added its own layer of danger, but it continued because the authorities could not easily enforce a rule in a place they were not themselves willing to go. And then there were the crossing sweepers, which were perhaps the most visible of all the street trades to the respectable Londoner walking to his office or his club. A crossing sweeper held a narrow beat at a busy road junction, clearing a path through the horse dung and mud and general filth of a Victorian street so that ladies with long skirts and gentlemen with clean boots could cross without ruining themselves. In return, the crossing sweeper hoped, and was by custom entitled to expect, a small tip. A penny, perhaps a halfpenny. some generous soul occasionally, a silver coin. The sweeper's tool was simply a broom, and his or her territory was that particular crossing, which was by informal custom theirs and could be defended against interlopers with some ferocity. It was a trade with almost no barrier to entry and almost no income, but it was a trade, and it was conducted in the open air and on one's own terms, and it was not the workhouse. What all of these trades shared was their absolute insecurity. The costermonger's income varied by the weather and the season, and the crop and the competition. The mudlark's income varied by the tide and the luck of what the mud had received from the river. The tosher's income varied by what the city had carelessly lost beneath itself. There was no week in which any of these people could be confident of the following week's income, and no year in which they could be confident of the following year. This was the world that Charles Booth, a Liverpool shipping merchant who became one of the Victorian era's great social investigators, set himself to map. From 1886 onward, for nearly 2 decades, Booth and his researchers walked through London, street by street, house by house, recording the occupations and incomes of the families they found. The result was what became known as the poverty map, a vast colour-coded representation of London by the income of its inhabitants, with the darkest colours marking the streets where poverty was most extreme, and lighter colours rising toward the merely struggling, and then the comfortable, and then the well-to-do. When Booth did his arithmetic on what he had found, the number that emerged was roughly 30%. Approximately 3 people in every 10 in London lived at or below what Booth called the poverty line, an income so low that it did not reliably provide for basic physical needs. That poverty line was not a comfortable abstraction. It was the point at which a family could not count on enough food, enough warmth, enough of the minimum material conditions of survival. And 1 person in 3 in the greatest city on earth was, by that measure, living on or below it. The single rented room that the labouring poor family most often occupied was a world unto itself, or rather, a world compressed far beyond what it was ever meant to contain. The rookeries, the dense and decaying slum districts of which St. Giles in central London was perhaps the most notorious, were places where single houses built for one family had been subdivided over and over again until each room held a family. Each staircase was its own small neighbourhood, and the standpipe in the yard or the street served everyone within reach. There might be no water inside the building at all. Sanitation was shared and often inadequate and sometimes non-existent. Privacy was a concept that the architecture of the place made purely theoretical. Noise, smell, and the physical warmth of other human bodies were the constants. And yet even here, even in a single rented room in a St. Giles rookery, a family's relationship to the pawnbroker told you almost everything about the rhythm of their week. The pawnbroker was not for the labouring poor a symbol of desperation or disgrace. He was an institution almost as regular and as expected as the landlord or the baker. The Sunday best clothes, the father's suit that was kept carefully folded and worn perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, were pawned on Monday morning. The ticket went into a drawer or a pocket, and the small sum of money raised went toward the week's food and rent. On Saturday, payday arrived, and on Saturday afternoon or evening, the ticket was redeemed, the clothes came home and were hung up again, ready for Sunday. And then on Monday, the cycle began again. It was not a failure. It was a financial system, adapted precisely to an income that arrived once a week and disappeared well before the week was done. We have spent some time at the lower rungs now, looking at the texture of those lives from inside them. And from here the ladder begins to rise, not in great dramatic leaps, but in the small, incremental, fiercely defended steps that meant everything to the people climbing them. The next step up is not a different world in the way that the aristocrat's world is different from the pauper's. It is a different world in the way that the inside of a house is different from the outside, And that difference to the people living it was everything: domestic service. The words have a comfortable, even a slightly romantic sound to them, the image of a great country house of silver on the sideboard and bells in a row and a fire burning in the morning room. And there were great houses, certainly. There were houses with 40 servants and more, with hierarchies as intricate as any government department, with specialists for every conceivable domestic function. But the far more common reality of Victorian domestic service was something much simpler and much harder. It was a single young woman, often from the countryside, often in her teens, alone in a modest suburban house, doing every task that the house required from before 5 in the morning until well after 10 at night. She was called a maid of all work, and her title was literally accurate. She was all the work. She was the kitchen and the laundry and the cleaning and the coal and the water and the fire and the blacking of the stove and the scrubbing of the step, all of it contained in one person, who slept in an attic room that was cold in winter and suffocating in summer, and received very little money and, if she was fortunate, occasional days off. By 1891, over 1 million women in Britain were employed in domestic service. 1 million. It was the single largest category of female employment in the country, larger than any factory or mill or shop. The women who entered service often did so because the alternatives were worse, or because a relative had found them a place, or because service at least provided a roof and a bed and a certainty of meals, even if those meals were modest ones. Many of them had come from families that themselves struggled against poverty, and entering service was a step up in the sense that it guaranteed shelter and food in a way that street work or casual labor could not guarantee. The daily round of a scullery maid in even a moderately sized household began well before the family woke. The fire in the kitchen range had to be lit so that the cook would have heat when she came down. Before the fire could be lit, the grate had to be cleaned of the ash from the night before and cleaned with blacking to restore the black iron surface, because a properly maintained kitchen range was black-leaded, a job that covered the hands and arms in black polish and had to be done every morning without fail. The coal scuttle had to be filled from the coal store, and the coal store was usually at the back of the house or in the cellar, which meant carrying heavy loads upstairs. The kitchen water jugs had to be filled from the pump or the tap. The kitchen floor had to be swept. All of this before the cook arrived downstairs, before breakfast was prepared, before the family stirred, and the day had barely started. In a grander household, the servants' world below stairs was a society of its own, with ranks as precisely observed as any system above. The butler sat at the top, and his authority in the male domain was absolute. The housekeeper was his female counterpart, mistress of the linen and the stores and the female staff, and she occupied a suite of rooms that gave her a private dignity to match her status. Between them, they commanded the household's domestic life as thoroughly as any two officers commanding a regiment. Below them came the cook, who had her own domain and her own pride, and was not a woman to be trifled with. Then the lady's maid, who attended to the mistress personally, looking after her wardrobe and her hair, and her private correspondence, and who, as a consequence, often knew more of the family's affairs than anyone else in the building. The valet, who performed the same function for the master. The footmen, those tall and well-built young men whose role was partly practical and partly decorative, carrying things and answering doors and being visible in the hallway in a way that said, without words, that this was a house of consequence. The housemaids who cleaned, the kitchen maids who assisted the cook, and at the very bottom, beneath the housemaids and the kitchen maids and even the between maid, a figure so junior she barely registered as an individual in the household's accounting, was the tweenie. The tweenie was so named because she belonged between two domains, serving both the cook and the housekeeper and properly belonging to neither. She swept and she scrubbed and she carried and she ran errands, and she occupied a position in the household hierarchy so low that the structure above her sometimes seemed less like a ladder and more like a cliff face. The place where these distinctions were enacted most precisely every single day was the servants' hall, the room below stairs where the household staff ate their meals. They sat in rank order, the butler at the head of the table, the housekeeper beside him, the footmen in their places, the housemaids in theirs, the kitchen staff at the far end. And in the grandest houses there was a further refinement. The upper servants, the butler, and the housekeeper, and the cook, and the lady's maid, and the valet, referred to by the lower staff as the pugs, would eat the first course of the midday meal in the servants' hall with everyone else, and then they would rise and withdraw to the housekeeper's room for the pudding course. This room was called, by those not invited into it, the pug's parlour, and the very act of withdrawal, that quiet rising and departure with the dessert course while the lower servants remained behind, was a performance of rank as deliberate and as charged as anything enacted in the dining room one floor above. Mrs. Isabella Beeton, whose book of household management appeared in 1861 and became the most widely consulted domestic authority of the era, codified all of this in terms so explicit that the book reads less like a cookbook and more like a constitution. Mrs. Beeton specified the wages appropriate to each level of servant, from the wages of a senior butler or experienced cook down to the few pounds a year paid to a scullery maid. And she did more than specify wages. She laid out with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly what her readers needed to know, which servants a household at a given income level could be expected to keep. A family with a certain income kept certain servants. A family with a larger income kept more and of a higher grade. The relationship between servant count and social position was not incidental, it was the measure. And at the bottom of the measure, at the very threshold of the question, was a single servant, one servant, a girl of all work, because to keep even a single live-in maid was to be, in the social grammar of the era, definitively middle class. This was the line, not a thick line, not an obvious one to eyes that cannot see what the Victorians saw, but a line as real as a wall. A household that kept a maid had removed its women from the rough work. The mistress of the house did not scrub her own steps, did not carry her own coal, did not black her own grate. Someone else did those things, and the fact of that someone else declared to every visitor and neighbour and tradesman who came to the door that this household was not one that laboured with its hands. The presence of a maid was the presence of that declaration, repeated every day by the simple fact of her existence in the house, and households that could barely afford to pay a girl's wages, that had to carefully calculate whether the sixpence or the shilling a week could be sustained, often stretched themselves to keep her anyway, because the alternative, the absence of a maid, the reverting to doing the rough work oneself, was a social descent that could not be risked. Some of what governing the servant's life looked like from the servant's side was strange, even by the standards of a strange era. Servants in grander households were, in certain particulars, expected to be invisible in a very literal sense. If a member of the family appeared unexpectedly in a corridor or on a staircase while a servant was working there, the servant was expected to turn to face the wall and remain still until the family member had passed, not to look, not to be looked at, to become, as nearly as a human being can, a feature of the architecture rather than a person occupying the same space. Footmen in some households were required to answer not by their own names, but by a generic name assigned to the position. A household that had always called its footman James would continue to call the next footman James, and the one after that, regardless of what their mothers had named them, because it was the position that mattered, not the person filling it. The person filling it was changeable, interchangeable, replaceable, and replaceable was the operative word, because what kept a servant in place and what could destroy them entirely was a document so small and so simple that it seems almost impossible it could carry such weight: the character reference. When a servant left one position, whether by choice or by dismissal, they required a written reference from their former employer in order to be considered for another place. Without a good character, as it was called, a servant was not merely unemployed. A servant without a character was unemployable. No household would take on a servant who could not produce a written statement from a reputable previous employer attesting to their honesty, their diligence, and their moral conduct. And if a servant was dismissed without a character for whatever reason, with or without cause, whether fairly or through a misunderstanding, or through the capricious displeasure of an employer who had simply changed their mind, the consequences could be permanent. A dismissed without character servant might never find another position. And without a position, without the shelter and the food and the small wages that a position provided, there was only one direction to go, and it was the direction of the street, and below the street, the workhouse. This was the power that the character reference represented, not merely an employer's assessment, an economic lifeline, the entire foundation on which a servant's ability to survive was built, and it rested entirely in the hands of the people the servant worked for, which meant that the relationship between servant and employer was not simply one of labor for payment, but of an almost total dependency that extended far beyond the hours of work and the amount of the wage. The servant's present and future both lived inside the employer's good opinion. And the employer's good opinion was maintained by invisibility, by silence, by the turned face in the corridor, by answering to whatever name was given, by being whatever the household needed, and not quite anything else at all. We have come some distance now from the workhouse and the casual ward, from the coffin-shaped bed in the spike and the unmarked grave at the end of a pauper's life. The labourer and the servant were not the pauper. They had their freedom, or a version of it, the mudlark's freedom to choose the cold foreshore rather than the regulated institution, the servant's freedom to hand in notice and walk out the gate. But they were not, by any measure that the century would later develop, secure. And they were not, in the grammar of Victorian society, respectable in the fullest sense of the word, that resonant, heavy, carefully freighted word that carried so much of the era's deepest anxiety. Respectability was not simply a matter of being good or honest or decent, though it required those things. It was a visible condition, one that had to be maintained and performed and displayed, and its central requirement was the maintenance of certain appearances, a clean address, a kept household, a way of presenting oneself to the world that said, without needing to say it, that one was above certain things, above certain kinds of work, above certain kinds of dwellings, above the kind of life that could be seen from the outside as belonging to the manual and the dependent and the vulnerable. The servant, however skilled and however trusted, lived in someone else's house and performed labour with her hands and body, and however genteel her bearing and however spotless her apron, the grammar of the era placed her below the line of full respectability, which is why the families that valued respectability most were sometimes the hardest employers to work for, because the servant was, in a sense, the proof of their own elevation, and that proof required constant maintenance. The next rung up the ladder was the one at which the terror of slipping became most acute, the one at which the anxiety that we have been following since we descended into the workhouse reached its highest pitch. Not at the bottom, not among the mudlarks or the purefinders or the servants. The most frightened people in Victorian England were not the ones who had already fallen. They were the ones who had just barely, by calculation and sacrifice and the careful management of appearances, managed not to. They were the clerks, the men in the black coats and the clean linen collars who walked to their offices each morning through the terraced streets of Holloway and Clapham and Camberwell, who carried with them an anxiety so refined and so constant that it had become, for many of them, simply the texture of being alive. They earned, many of them, roughly, what a skilled artisan earned. A good carpenter, a steady printer, a compositor with a reliable employer. These men might bring home wages that matched or even exceeded those of a junior clerk at an insurance firm or a railway company. The money was sometimes identical, and yet the clerk and the carpenter inhabited different worlds, different rungs of the ladder, different cosmologies of self-understanding, and the distance between them was maintained not by income, but by an object so cheap and so simple that it seems almost ridiculous to hold it up as the boundary between two classes of human being. A collar, a clean linen collar, white and stiff, that told any observer at a glance that the man wearing it did not do manual work, did not sweat through his shirt, did not come home with his hands darkened by grease or his back bent by lifting. The collar was a signal, and it was a very precise one. It said, "I work with my mind, not my body. I sit at a desk, I handle paper." And it said this in a language that every person in Victorian England could read without effort, because the grammar of class was written in fabric and cut, and the angle of a brim, and everyone had been reading it since childhood. This is where the word came from, white collar. It did not arise as a metaphor or a retrospective coinage of later sociologists, though sociologists would later reach for it gratefully. It arose from the actual collar, the actual white linen, the actual daily performance of a distinction that a man would protect before he protected almost anything else, because the distinction was, in many cases, the most valuable thing he owned. And the clerk, that man in the black coat, would guard it with a ferocity that could look, to an outside eye, like vanity or even absurdity. He would spend more than he could reasonably afford on a respectable address in a respectable suburb. He would keep a parlour that was not really used for anything, a room of quiet, dusted furniture and modest ornaments that sat behind the front window of his terraced house, not because anyone enjoyed being in it particularly, but because it was there, visible, proof to any passer-by that this was a household with a room to spare for best occasions, a household that did not need every square foot of its dwelling for sleeping and eating. He would, if he could manage it at all, keep a servant, even the simplest, youngest, most inexperienced girl from the country, because keeping a servant was the mark, the undeniable mark, that one had crossed a threshold, and the clerk would stretch his budget in extraordinary ways to stay on the right side of it. George and Weedon Grossmith understood this with the precision of naturalists. Their Diary of a Nobody, published in its book form in 1892 after running in the pages of Punch, is not a satire in the cruel sense. It does not mock Charles Pooter of the Laurels Holloway from above. It watches him from beside him, which is a much more affectionate and more devastating vantage point. Pooter is a senior clerk. He lives in a semi-detached house in Holloway, a suburb of North London that had grown, as Clapham and Camberwell had grown, in the south, precisely to accommodate the vast new stratum of black-coated men that the railways and banks and insurance offices and the expanding civil service were producing in the second half of the century. These suburbs were not fashionable, they were not grand. They were respectable, which was a different thing entirely, and in some ways a more demanding thing, because fashion does not require constant vigilance, whereas respectability does. Pooter worries about the right things in precisely the wrong proportions. He is devastated when a tradesman fails to show him sufficient deference. He is thrown into confusion by a small social snub at a party. He spends paragraphs of anxious mental effort on questions of domestic propriety that the class above him would not notice and the class below him would not understand. And this is the genius of the portrait, and also the most accurate document of a rung, because Pooter is not performing anxiety for comic effect. He is doing what the lower middle actually did, which was to treat the preservation of status as the central work of life, more important than pleasure, more important in many ways than comfort, because status, once lost, was extraordinarily difficult to recover, and the distance between where he stood and the rung below was not very far at all. This is the contrarian truth at the heart of the ladder we are climbing. We expect the most suffering and the most fear to live at the bottom. We descend into the workhouse and we see the Andover inmates gnawing the marrow from bones set aside for fertiliser. And we think, here is where the misery concentrates. And it does. The physical suffering of the pauper, the precariousness of the labourer waiting at the dock gate, the exhaustion of the maid of all work on her knees at the cold grate in the pre-dawn dark. These are real, and they are terrible, and they require no diminishment. But the terror, the particular quality of social fear that ran through Victorian life like a low, continuous current, was most acute, not at the bottom, but one rung above it, or two or three. At the point where there was just enough to lose that losing it became the primary organizing anxiety of every waking hour. A man who had nothing to protect. A man who had a collar, an address, a parlour, kept for best, a grudging submission from the local tradespeople, a man who had assembled, at great effort and at some financial cost to himself, the minimum necessary architecture of lower middle respectability, that man lay awake with fears the pauper had already moved past, because the pauper had already lost. The clerk had not, and the gap between having not lost and losing was, on this rung of the ladder, measured in very small things. A prolonged illness, a lost position, a landlord's notice, a single bad quarter. Any one of these could dissolve the whole careful structure overnight, and what waited below was not merely poverty, it was poverty without the moral insulation of the respectable class, poverty that would be read by the world as a deserved fall, a failure of character because respectability in the Victorian framework was not just a material condition, but a moral one, and to fall from it was to fall in every sense simultaneously. So the clerk watched the collar, he watched the address, he watched the servant if he had one, he watched the language he used in conversation, the way he referred to his midday meal, the hour at which he ate it. And here we pay the second open loop we planted several chapters ago, the promise that a single word spoken at the wrong hour of the day could expose a man's class as surely as if he had written it on a card. The word was dinner. Dinner, in the Victorian working household, was the midday meal. The main meal of the day, taken when work paused and appetite was sharpest, eaten at noon or 1 o'clock, and substantial enough to carry a man through his afternoon's labour. It was called dinner because it was dinner, and nobody who grew up in a labouring or artisanal household had any reason to call it anything else. But the genteel household, the household that considered itself a cut above, that aspired to the register of professional or leisured life, ate its main meal in the evening. The midday pause was luncheon, or at least it was called luncheon, a lighter affair between breakfast and the main event, and the word announced, with terrible clarity, that this household ran on a different schedule, the schedule of people who did not need to eat heartily at noon because they were not doing the kind of work that demanded it. They sat at desks, they managed things. Their physical energy was moderate, and their afternoons did not require the same fuel as a man swinging a hammer or pulling an oar. And so the lower middle-class household faced a daily choice. If you called your midday meal dinner, you were using the language of the working class. If you called it luncheon, or even lunch, you were performing the language of the class above you. And this performance cost nothing. It required no expenditure, no address change, no new coat. It was free, which is exactly why it was policed so carefully, because if the signal is free, then anyone can produce it. And if anyone can produce it, it loses its power. And so the upper reaches of the middling class became expert at detecting the false note, the word used slightly wrongly, the timing slightly off, the pronunciation that betrayed the aspiration as an aspiration rather than a birthright. The The parlour kept for best operated on the same logic. In a genuinely working household, every room was a working room. Space was too precious, furniture too expensive, rooms too few for any of them to sit idle behind a closed door. But in the lower middle household, the parlour was precisely that idle room, the room that existed not to be lived in, but to be maintained, dusted and displayed, its aspidistra in the window, and its antimacassars on the chairbacks, and its modest collection of ornaments arranged with care on the mantelpiece, all of it saying, "We have a room we do not need to use. We can afford that luxury." Look through the window, please. Look at how we live. And callers were invited into the parlour, always. The daily life of the household happened elsewhere, in the kitchen, in the living room behind the parlour. But the caller was met in the best room, the performed room, the room that was designed to communicate the right impression before a word was spoken. This is what the lower middle rung looked like from the inside. And it is worth pausing in it for a moment before we move up, because the logic of performance and display that we find here, so concentrated, so anxious, so near the surface, this logic does not disappear as we climb. It simply becomes more expensive, more elaborate, more confident in its own right, less visibly effortful. The great secret of the ladder is that everyone on it is performing. The difference is that the higher rungs had been performing so long and so successfully that they no longer looked like performances at all. One step above the clerk and one step below the professional was a rung that carried its own particular set of anxieties, different in character, but not in intensity. The shopkeeper, the tradesman, the man whose livelihood depended on buying things and selling them, on serving customers across a counter, on the daily, visible, undeniable transaction of commerce. The word trade was weighted in the Victorian vocabulary in a way that can be difficult to appreciate now. We live in a world that has largely abandoned the old distinction between commerce and gentility, in which a successful entrepreneur is celebrated rather than looked down upon, in which the billionaire is the cultural apex and not an embarrassment. The Victorians had not made this adjustment. Trade, the direct sale of goods, the management of a shop, the handling of money across a counter, carried a taint that enormous wealth could not entirely erase, and the higher the rung a family aspired to, the more carefully it had to manage its distance from anything that smelled of selling. A duke's daughter could not marry into trade without scandal, not because the tradesman's money was insufficient, and not because his character was necessarily inferior, but because the social grammar of the era held that certain forms of making money were incompatible with the station of a gentleman's family, and the direct sale of goods was chief among them. The professions, the law, the church, medicine, the army, were respectable precisely because they did not involve this kind of transaction. The barrister did not sell his services like a merchant selling cloth. The clergyman did not charge for his prayers. The army officer did not negotiate the price of his sword. These fictions were important. They were the fictions that separated earning a living respectably from earning it in trade, and maintaining them required considerable collective effort. The shopkeeper, then, inhabited a space of profound social ambiguity. He might be prosperous, a successful draper, or grocer in a good neighbourhood, could accumulate real money, could live well, could employ a considerable number of people. But the act of keeping the shop, of standing behind the counter and wrapping parcels and taking payments and saying good morning to customers, placed him in a category from which no amount of wealth could entirely extract him while he continued to do it. He was in trade, and being in trade meant that certain doors remained closed, certain social circles maintained a cautious distance, certain connections were declined. The shopkeeper often lived over the shop, literally. The premises were his premises, the commercial space below and the domestic space above, inseparable in a way that the professional household could not tolerate, because the professional household maintained a careful distance between the place where money was made and the place where life was lived. The doctor's surgery might be attached to his house, but it was not the same as his house. The shopkeeper had no such separation. The counter and the kitchen were part of the same building, and sometimes of the same day, and this physical collapse of the commercial and the domestic was itself a mark of rank. Below the shopkeeper in the commercial hierarchy were the shop assistants, and their condition illuminates the rung from a different angle. The great drapery houses and retail establishments of Victorian cities operated on what was called the living-in system, and it was a system of extraordinary control. Young men and women from the country brought to the city to work as assistants in the drapery trade or the haberdashery or the grocery were not simply employed. They were housed. They slept in dormitories above the shop, ate in the shop's dining rooms, came and went under the shop's rules, and paid fines for infractions ranging from lateness to untidiness to speaking when they should have been silent. Their hours were extraordinary. 80 hours a week was not unusual. The shop opened from early morning to late evening 6 days a week, with the assistants expected to be present and presentable throughout. Their wages were modest, their freedom of movement was minimal, and yet they were not servants in the domestic sense, and they were not labourers in the industrial sense. They occupied a strange, intermediate territory, bound to an employer with a nearness and a completeness that recalled the old apprenticeship systems, but without the apprenticeship's promise of eventual mastery. The living-in system became, in the later decades of the century, the focus of reform campaigns and journalistic attention because its conditions were recognizably harsh, even by the standards of an era that expected harsh conditions. But it persisted because it suited the employer, who could extract maximum hours and maintain maximum discipline over a workforce that could not easily leave, and because it suited the assistant's family back in the provinces, who knew that their child was housed and fed and off their hands, even if the housing was a shared dormitory and the feeding was institutional. And here is the ambition that ran through the commercial rung like a quiet river beneath everything else. The successful tradesman's dream was not to do trade better, or to expand the shop, or to open more shops. The dream was to stop, to accumulate enough, by whatever means the shop and the careful management of its proceeds allowed, to retire from trade entirely, to sell the business, to move to a house that was not above a shop, to send the children to schools where the accent and the manner and the associations of the counting house would be gradually sanded away, and to present, in the next generation, if not in this one, a family that had no visible connection to commerce at all. The children would be educated. They would acquire the posture and the vocabulary and the social manners of the genteel. They would not go into trade, they would go into a profession, or they would marry into one, or they would simply exist as people of modest independent means who had forgotten publicly where the money came from. This is the Victorian version of social mobility, and it is slower and more uncertain and more expensive than the phrase implies. It is not a single leap, but a generational project, a careful laundering of origins across decades, requiring not just money but the right schools, the right suburb, the right connections, the right marriage, the right story told about oneself in the right rooms. Many families managed it, at least partially. Many more tried and fell short. And the anxiety of being in trade, of not yet having escaped it, of having children who still knew what it felt like to live above a counter. That anxiety shaped the commercial rung as surely as the collar shaped the clerical one. Now we come to the rung that the tradesman dreamed of reaching. Not the aristocracy. That was too remote, too different, too obviously impossible for most aspirations. Not even the landed gentry whose position depended on inheritance rather than achievement. The professional middle class was the dream destination of the ambitious tradesman's grandchildren, the rung that combined income and respectability without requiring birth or land, the rung that said, "We make our living, but we make it in the right ways." The professions that conferred this status were a specific and relatively small set. The Church of England, the established church, whose clergymen occupied country livings and cathedral appointments, and school chaplaincies across the nation. The law, divided with considerable internal precision between barristers, who argued cases before courts and whose position was gentlemanly in character, and solicitors, who handled the documentary and administrative side of legal life, and who ranked somewhat below, though still firmly within the respectable middle. Medicine, similarly divided. Physicians at the top, surgeons below them, apothecaries below the surgeons, a hierarchy that reflected not current reality, but historical origin, since by the Victorian period surgeons were trained, skilled, and often essential, but the category still carried the residue of its craft trade past. This last distinction deserves a moment of careful attention because it is one of the strangest survivals in the whole architecture of Victorian class, and it persists in attenuated form into the present day. The surgeon in Victorian England was addressed not as Doctor, but as Mr. Not Dr. Jones, Mr. Jones. And this was not an oversight or a clerical error, it was deliberate. It was a status marker, and the reason it was a status marker is that surgery, in its earlier history, had been practiced by barber surgeons, men who cut hair and pulled teeth and lanced boils and performed amputations all under the same professional roof. The barber's pole's red stripe a relic of that bloody, manual craft trade past. When surgery eventually separated from barbering and became a distinct discipline, it carried the stigma of its origins. It was manual work. It involved using one's hands on another person's body in a physical, direct, visceral way that pure medicine, the physician who observed and diagnosed and prescribed, but who might never cut or touch in the surgical sense, did not. And so the physician was doctor and the surgeon was Mr., and Mr. was the lesser title, the reminder that surgery was still, in some residual cultural memory, closer to a trade. The extraordinary thing is that this distinction inverted itself, quietly, over time. As surgery became more complex, more essential, more prestigious, as anesthesia arrived in the 1840s and antiseptic technique in the 1860s, and surgery expanded to encompass things that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations, the title Mr., rather than being shed, became a mark of distinction among surgeons themselves, a badge of professional pride, an assertion of identity and tradition. To this day, a consultant surgeon in Britain is addressed as Mr. and not as Doctor, and this is understood by everyone within the profession as the senior title, not the lesser one. The status hangover of Victorian class had been so thoroughly absorbed and reinterpreted that it now functions as its own form of exclusivity, which is perhaps the most Victorian outcome imaginable. The Army and the Navy offered another route to gentlemanly professional status, and here the Victorian era presents one of its most naked admissions about the relationship between money and rank. For most of the period, an officer's commission in the British Army could be purchased. You did not earn it by demonstrating military ability or passing an examination or rising through the ranks by merit. You bought it. The price varied by regiment and by rank. A commission in a fashionable cavalry regiment cost considerably more than one in an infantry regiment of less distinction. But the principle was consistent. Officer status was a commodity, openly available to those who could pay for it, denied to those who could not, regardless of their capability. This system, which would seem extraordinary in almost any modern military context, made perfect sense within the Victorian class framework because it ensured that the officer class was drawn from the same social stratum as the gentlemanly professions and the landed families, people of means who had the habits, the manners, the social connections, and the self-presentation appropriate to leading men, and who would not embarrass the regiment at dinner or on the social occasions that were as important to army life as the tactical ones. Whether they could actually fight was, in some quarters, a secondary consideration. The Cardwell reforms of 1871 abolished the purchase system, which was controversial and which was resisted with some heat by those whose financial investment in purchased commissions was thereby devalued, and the army moved toward a merit-based selection. But the social character of the officer class did not change overnight, because the habits and expectations and informal screening processes that sustained class homogeneity did not require a formal purchase system to operate. The right schools, the right clubs, the right introductions, these continued to work as filters long after the formal mechanism was gone. Among the civilian professions, the law occupied a position of particular prestige, and its internal customs illuminated the distance between professional and commercial logic very clearly. The barrister, the advocacy lawyer, the man who argued cases in court and who wore the wig and gown, and who practiced in the Inns of Court in London, did not, in the professional fiction of the era, work for money. He worked as a gentleman rendering service to a client, and the money he received was not a fee agreed in advance and paid for a service rendered as a commercial transaction. It was an honorarium, a gift, a voluntary token of the client's gratitude for the barrister's expertise, given freely by the client and accepted gracefully by the barrister. And the critical legal consequence of this fiction was that a barrister could not sue for his fees. If the client chose not to pay the honorarium, the barrister had no legal recourse, because to have legal recourse would have been to admit that the relationship was a commercial one, and admitting that would have pulled the barrister from the professional into the commercial register, which was precisely where the professional class worked hardest not to be. This is the elaborate architecture of fiction that separated the professional from the tradesman. The tradesman sold things. The professional provided services in a context of voluntary mutual regard between gentlemen. The distinction was not entirely illusory. The professions genuinely did involve different kinds of work, different training, different modes of social interaction. But the firmness with which the line was drawn and the energy expended in maintaining it speaks to how much was at stake in the distinction. To be in trade was to be below a line. To be in a profession was to be above it. And the line was, in the final analysis, a matter of collective agreement and constant maintenance, as all such lines were. The professional family lived differently from the tradesman's family, and the difference was visible. The house was a detached villa or a substantial semi-detached property, not a terraced house and not above a shop. It had a cook, at minimum, and usually a housemaid as well, and perhaps a parlour-maid to answer the door and serve at table, and if there were children, almost certainly a nurse or nursemaid. These were not one servant, but several, and the multiplicity mattered because Mrs. Beeton had been very clear on the relationship between household income and servant numbers, and the professional family that could keep 4 servants occupied a social position that the clerk, keeping a single girl, could not claim. The children were educated privately, which meant not in the board schools that the 1870 Education Act was beginning to spread across the country for the working and lower middle classes, but in preparatory schools and public schools in the case of the boys, and in educational arrangements of suitable gentility for the girls, who were not expected to pursue careers. The very fact that they did not need careers was itself a display of the household's position. The daughters of the professional family were what Coventry Patmore's celebrated poem of 1854 had called the angel in the house, the idealized domestic presence whose visibility as an idle and ornamental figure advertised the family's prosperity as clearly as the number of servants or the size of the garden. A working daughter was a daughter the family could not afford to keep unoccupied, and a family that could not afford to keep its daughters unoccupied was a family operating below a certain level. So the daughters were kept at home, given accomplishments, a little French, a little piano, a little watercolour, a little embroidery, and displayed to the social circle as evidence of comfort and correctness. Patmore's angel was not a simple celebration of feminine domesticity. She was a class signal, one of the most expensive ones the middle family could afford to produce, And even within this professional rung, the gradations continued. The physician whose practice served wealthy patients in a fashionable neighborhood occupied a different social position from the general practitioner serving a modest suburb. The barrister with chambers in a prestigious set and a regular flow of good briefs was a different creature from the struggling young barrister waiting years for his practice to grow. The clergyman with a wealthy country living in a cathedral town lived very differently from the curate scraping by on a stipend that barely covered his rent. The professional class was not monolithic. It was itself a ladder with its own internal rungs and its own anxieties about position within the category, and the professional who had arrived at a comfortable establishment watched with the same vigilance as the clerk watched the collar, watching for the signs that he was not slipping, that the practice was stable, that the family's position was secure. What all three of these rungs shared, see the clerical, the commercial, the professional, is the effort. The sustained, daily, expensive, exhausting effort of maintaining a position that was not guaranteed by birth and was not secured by any legal or institutional mechanism, but existed purely as a social fact, sustained by the agreement of the people around you to treat you as a member of your claimed rung. If that agreement was withdrawn, if the neighbours stopped calling, if the tradespeople stopped extending credit, if the invitations stopped arriving, if the right people stopped returning your cards, the rung itself dissolved, and there was nothing beneath you to catch the fall except the rungs you had been working so hard not to occupy. This is the world that Charles Pooter of the Laurels, Holloway, inhabited and understood perfectly and could not stop thinking about. Not because he was a fool or a snob, though the grossmiths allow him to be both at times, but because the system he lived in genuinely required this level of attention. It was not neurotic to worry about the collar, it was rational. The collar was doing real work every day in a social world where a single visible signal of the wrong register could shift the way you were treated by every person you encountered, which would shift the way those people treated your family, which would shift the social connections available to your children, which would shape the marriages they could make and the positions they could seek, and the lives they would eventually be able to claim. The ladder was real, and the rungs were real, and the distance between them was, very often, a single word: dinner. Spoken at noon in a house where the parlour was kept for best by a man in a black coat and a clean white collar who understood, in a way that required no explanation and brooked no argument, exactly what he was doing and why it mattered. We are not yet done climbing. There is still a long way to go. Above the professional class, above the comfortable villas and the housemaids and the daughters at their pianos, the ladder continues upward into regions where the anxieties change their character, where the performance of status becomes less effortful and more unconscious, where the machinery of class operates not through careful aspiration, but through the accumulated weight of generations. The man who has just earned his position watches it constantly. The man who inherited it long ago barely notices it at all, which is, in its own way, the most powerful position on the ladder. Not to need to try, not to need to watch, to simply be, without effort, what others work their entire lives to appear to be. And so we climb higher, above the professional class, above the villas and the quarterly coal bills and the worry about whether the parlourmaid's uniform is properly pressed. There exists a stratum where the relationship between money and social position becomes something stranger and more complicated than anything below it. Here, money's not the point, or rather, money is the foundation, but you must have it, and in large quantities. But to wear it openly, to speak of it directly, to allow it to be the visible justification of your standing, is itself a kind of vulgarity. The new rich discovered this rule the hard way over and over again throughout the Victorian century. The industrial fortunes were real and they were staggering. The men who built textile mills in Lancashire and Yorkshire, who sank iron foundries in the Midlands, who brewed beer in Birmingham and Burton-on-Trent, who floated railway companies on the London capital markets, who processed and shipped and banked and manufactured at a scale the world had never seen before. These men accumulated wealth that in sheer numerical terms dwarfed the income of many an ancient aristocratic family. A mill owner in the 1860s might clear an annual profit that would make a duke's land agent blink. A railway financier in the 1840s could paper the walls of a manor house with his dividends. The money was not the problem. The money was everywhere. The problem was what the money came from. In the Victorian social imagination, there was a clear and largely unconscious hierarchy of how wealth had been created, and it ran in the opposite direction from what you might expect. The most respectable money was the money that had been sitting still the longest, income from land, inherited over generations, requiring no active effort from its current holder. Below that sat the income of the professions, the church, the law, the medicine that required a learned education, even if it also required daily work. And below that, still further from the summit of respectability, came the money that had been made by buying and selling things, or by building and manufacturing things, or by employing large numbers of people to do those things on your behalf. The closer your fortune was to the actual physical process of making and selling, the less genteel it smelled. This was not, on its face, a logical arrangement. It was a sentimental one, rooted in a pre-industrial world where the gentleman lived on his rents, and the tradesman stood behind his counter, and the distinction between them was clean and old and comfortable. The Industrial Revolution had not changed the sentiment. It had simply created a large class of enormously wealthy men who found themselves, by the standards of the sentimental hierarchy, socially outranked by the younger son of a country squire who had never in his life done a day's productive work. The mill owner's response to this situation was, in almost every case, the same. He converted, not his religion usually, though that was sometimes part of it. He converted his money into the forms that the old hierarchy recognized as legitimate. He bought land, a country estate if he could manage it, acreage outside the city, a property with a proper name and a visible extent, and tenant farmers who paid him rent so that he could stand in the same relationship to the land as the old gentry stood. He built or renovated a house of appropriate scale. He pulled his children out of whatever commercial environment their upbringing had included and sent them to the right schools, the public schools, where they would acquire the accent and the manner and the social connections that money alone could not purchase. He encouraged his daughters to marry upward where possible, and he waited for the next generation to complete the work. For his grandchildren to have forgotten what exactly great-grandfather had done in the factory, and for everyone else to have forgotten too, or at least to have stopped mentioning it. Some of the wealthier and more far-sighted industrialists tried a different route alongside this private strategy. They became, conspicuously, benefactors. They built things that the public could see and admire, and that attached a noble sentiment to a commercial name. Robert Owen had already demonstrated one version of this at New Lanark in Scotland, where from the early years of the century he had built and managed a cotton mill community that was, by the standards of the time, something close to utopian. Decent housing for the workers, schools for the children, a care for the human beings who turned the machines that was almost without parallel in the industry. New Lanark became famous. People came from across Europe to look at it. Owen became, for a time, one of the most discussed social reformers in the world. Later in the century, the model village idea reappeared in different forms and with different emphases. Titus Salt, who had made his fortune in alpaca wool, the soft fibre combed from the South American alpaca, a material that had made Bradford's textile mills briefly famous, built Saltaire outside Bradford in the 1850s. It was a complete village, not just a factory, terraced houses for the workers, a church, an institute with a library and a reading room, almshouses for the retired, bathhouses a park, everything except, by deliberate policy, a pub. Salt was a temperance man, and he built his virtue into the brickwork. Saltaire still stands, and it is still recognizable as the expression of one man's idea of what the relationship between an employer and his workforce ought to look like. The Cadbury family, Quakers from Birmingham who had built their fortune in cocoa and chocolate, moved their factory out of the city centre to a greenfield site south of Birmingham in the 1870s and built Bourneville around it, a model village with gardens and open space and housing well above the standard of what workers in the city could otherwise afford. The Lever brothers, who had made their money in soap, built Port Sunlight on the Wirral Peninsula in the 1880s on similar principles. These were genuine acts of paternalism, and they were also simultaneously acts of reputation management and social positioning. An industrialist who built a village and a library and a park was not merely a man who had made money from manufacturing. He was a man of civic virtue, a benefactor, a figure worthy of public esteem. The factory might still smell of trade, but the model village smelled of something older and more respectable, something approaching the benevolent landlord's relationship with his tenants, which was itself one of the great fantasies of the English gentry tradition. The most dramatic conversion of industrial money into social rank, however, was the marriage market. And towards the end of the Victorian period, this market acquired an unexpected transatlantic dimension. American heiresses, the daughters of railroad barons and steel magnates and department store founders, began to appear in London society in significant numbers, bringing with them fortunes that made even prosperous English industrialists look modest, and bringing with them the entirely simple desire to acquire, in exchange for those fortunes, the social distinction that American money could not by itself provide. They were called, by contemporaries who watched this trade with a mixture of amusement and calculation, dollar princesses. And the men they married, or whose brothers or sons they married, were often members of the titled English aristocracy who needed, urgently and without embarrassment, the cash. It was a transaction dressed as a romance, and it worked for everyone. The American heiress got a title and a country house and a place in a social order that was, in some ways, more glamorous and more ancient than anything her own republic could offer. The English aristocrat or his family got enough money to repair the roof, to pay the debts, to keep the estate in a state that the estate's dignity required. And the whole arrangement confirmed, in a way that no one stated plainly but everyone understood, that what the aristocracy was selling was something real, something that money could not replicate from scratch but could only buy ready-made. They were selling ancestry, they were selling a name, they were selling the peculiar and untransferable authority that came from having been for a very long time in a position that other people deferred to. Below the peerage, but above the professional men in their suburban villas, sat the landed gentry. The gentry were a vast and various class, squires and baronets and untitled families of long standing who owned land in the counties and lived on what that land produced, not through their own labour, but through the labour of the tenant farmers who rented their fields and paid their rent on the quarter days. Quarter day, those fixed points in the agricultural calendar. Lady Day in March, Midsummer in June, Michaelmas in September, Christmas in December, when accounts were settled and the economic life of rural England paused and breathed and resumed. The squire did not farm, the squire owned the farm. The distinction was absolute. What the gentry had that the professional middle class lacked, and that the industrialists were perpetually trying to acquire, was a relationship with a particular piece of English ground that had been continuous across generations. Your family had been here before you. The farms you collected rent from had been your grandfather's farms and his grandfather's farms. The church you attended had your family's memorials in the walls. Your name was the name of the place, sometimes literally. The kind of identification between family and land that goes so deep it stops feeling like ownership and starts feeling like simple fact. you did not own Longbury Hall. You were the family of Longbury Hall. The distinction to anyone inside the system was entirely clear. The engine that maintained this continuity was primogeniture. The eldest son inherited everything: the estate, the house, the title if there was one, the rental income, the social position, the name on the gate. The younger sons received, typically, a small capital sum, an education, and an expectation that they would make their own way in the world using the connections their family name could open, but without much in the way of material support. This sounds harsh, and in practice it frequently was, but it had an important structural consequence for Victorian society. The gentry's younger sons, educated, well-connected, carrying a family name that opened doors but without independent income, were pushed into exactly the occupations that the professional middle class was simultaneously trying to make respectable. They went into the church. They took commissions in the army. They read for the bar. And this meant that the gentlemanly professions were perpetually refreshed with men who were, by birth and upbringing, genuinely gentlemen, which in turn helped maintain the profession's claim to social dignity. The great social event that organized the gentry and the peerage together into a single functioning marriage market was the London season. When Parliament sat, roughly from the spring into the summer, the great families came to London, opening their townhouses, attending their dinners and balls and receptions, and staging, under the decorous surface of social occasion, the most important economic transaction of the class, the marriage of its daughters. A young woman of the gentry or the peerage was, at the appropriate age, brought out. She was presented at court, a formal ceremony in which she was introduced to the Queen, or in later decades, to the Queen's representative, as a mark of her eligibility and social standing. She then entered the season, the balls, the garden parties, the opera, the race meetings at Ascot, the parade in Hyde Park. She was looked at, she was assessed, she was introduced to suitable men, and in the compressed weeks of the season she was expected to lay the groundwork for a match that would determine, more than almost any other single event, what the rest of her life would consist of. The match was not, or not openly, a commercial transaction, but everyone involved understood its commercial dimension. A well-dowried daughter from a prosperous gentry family represented not just a wife, but a financial settlement, money that would come into the husband's estate on the marriage, money that would maintain the wife in the style appropriate to her birth, and money that would eventually pass to the children. Conversely, a daughter who did not match well or who did not match at all was a problem, a financial burden and a social puzzle to be managed by the family with varying degrees of kindness. For the gentry, the great anxiety of the second half of the Victorian century was not the season. The season more or less took care of itself, a self-regulating social machine with its own momentum. The great anxiety was the land, specifically what was happening to the income that land produced. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 had already nudged open the door to cheaper imported grain. The Corn Laws had been a protectionist tariff system that kept the price of domestic wheat artificially high, which was good for the landlords who grew it and bad for the factory workers who needed cheap bread. Their repeal, bitterly contested and eventually forced through by Robert Peel against his own party, opened the British market to cheaper foreign grain. The immediate consequences for the gentry were manageable. Other factors kept agricultural rents relatively stable for some years after. But the deeper consequences arrived in the 1870s and 1880s when a combination of catastrophically bad harvests in Britain and a flood of cheap American grain carried across the Atlantic in the new steamships at a cost that would have been impossible a generation earlier, and refrigerated meat from Australia and Argentina, which the new refrigerated ships could now deliver fresh to British ports, collapsed the agricultural prices on which gentry income depended. Rents fell. Farms that had been let at comfortable rates found tenants unable to pay or unable to find successors when the lease expired. Land that had seemed the securest of all assets, because it did not go bankrupt, because it was always there, because it had always provided in the past, suddenly proved to be not a foundation, but a vulnerability. Families that had lived comfortably for generations found themselves squeezed. The agricultural depression of the 1870s and 1880s and into the 1890s was a genuine crisis for the landed interest, and it set in motion the long, slow decline of the gentry as a class. A decline that would not reach its visible culmination until the death duties and the wars of the next century, but whose roots were here in these decades of falling rents and failing harvests. And above the gentry, at the very summit of the ladder, sat the peerage. Duke, Marquis, Earl, Viscount, Baron, 5 degrees of titled rank, each carrying a hereditary title that passed from father to eldest son, each entitling the holder to sit in the House of Lords, each conferring an automatic precedence in every social situation that required one, which was all of them. The peerage was not large. In a country of tens of millions of people, the hereditary peerage numbered in the hundreds, and within that small group, the wealthiest families were among the richest human beings on earth. A great ducal estate could extend across tens of thousands of acres, not just in one county, but in several. Spread across different regions of England, Scotland, Ireland, perhaps Wales, a portfolio of agricultural land and urban property and mineral rights and timber, and increasingly in the later century, royalties from coal seams that lay beneath the surface of farms that had been in the family for centuries, and that suddenly, with the expansion of the railways and the steel industry, were worth an entirely new kind of money. The Duke of Bedford owned large parts of Bloomsbury. The Duke of Westminster owned large parts of Mayfair and Belgravia. These were not merely country estates, these were stakes in the exploding land values of the Victorian city. In 1873, the government conducted a survey beneficially the return of owners of land, but quickly nicknamed the New Domesday after William the Conqueror's great census of 1086, because what it revealed had something of the same quality of stark, astonishing revelation. It showed in numbers that could be examined and could not easily be argued with, that the land of Britain was concentrated in an extraordinarily small number of hands. A few thousand families, perhaps 4,000 or 5,000, owned roughly half the land in England and Wales. The very grandest estates, owned by a few hundred families at most, controlled a share of the national territory that would be difficult to comprehend without actually looking at the figures. The New Domesday did not change this, but it named it. It put a number to it. And in an era when the Reform Acts had been extending the franchise and the public conversation had begun to include questions about who owned what and why, naming it was itself a political act. The aristocrat, in the daily texture of his life, moved through a world that was organized around him in ways that had been refined over centuries. The country house was not simply a large home. It was an institution, a functioning economy with its own hierarchy of indoor and outdoor staff, its butler and housekeeper, who were themselves figures of considerable authority and income, its footmen and gamekeepers and gardeners and grooms and stable hands and kitchen staff, all of them organized in a structure as formal as any regiment's. The great house ran on ritual. Meals arrived at their appointed times. The dressing bell rang, the gong sounded. Guests changed clothes. Morning dress for the morning, country dress for the afternoon walk or shoot, formal dress for dinner, in a daily rhythm of costume changes that would strike a modern observer as extraordinary, but that was, to its participants, simply what one did. The shooting party, the deer stalk in Scotland, the elaborate dinner with its many courses and its precisely arranged seating, the after-dinner withdrawal of the ladies so that the men could drink port and talk about things that ladies were not expected to discuss. These were the rituals through which rank was performed and confirmed and reproduced, because rank required performance. Even at the very top of the ladder, the position was not simply had, it was enacted constantly in an elaborate theatre of manners and precedence and visible display. And the more you knew about the rules of that theatre, the more precisely you could read every performance within it, and the more precisely you could detect in any given performance the tiny errors that marked the actor as someone who had learned the role rather than been born into it. This is where the system revealed its deepest and most exquisite sophistication. The rituals that policed each rung were not arbitrary. They were designed, not consciously designed, not by any single author, but evolved over generations, to be learnable by someone within the class and very nearly unlearnable by someone outside it. You could memorize the rules, you could study the etiquette manuals, of which there were a great many. Debrett's correct form had been organizing questions of precedence and address since the 18th century, and it was joined in the Victorian period by a library of guides to the precise observance of every social occasion. You could learn which fork to use and when. You could practice the curtsy and the bow. You could get all of this right, and you could still be spotted. The calling card was a ritual of this kind. Every household of any pretension maintained a supply of cards, small rectangles of stiff pasteboard, with the name printed in a careful script, and the exchange of cards was the fundamental grammar of social admission. You called on someone. If they were not at home, and not at home could mean literally absent or could mean receiving not today, a distinction that the caller was expected to understand and not probe. You left your card in the silver tray by the door. The card's corner might be folded down in a particular direction depending on the purpose of the call: a personal visit, a congratulation, a condolence, a first introduction. The woman of the house would review the cards and decide in her own time whether to return the call, and a returned call was an acceptance of acquaintance, an opening of the social door. A call not returned was a refusal, delivered silently and without confrontation, requiring no explanation and permitting no appeal. This system sounds, to a modern ear, both elaborate and oddly passive, but it was efficient precisely because it was elaborate. The complexity itself was the filter. You had to know when to call and when not to call, on which days a particular household received, whether your own social position entitled you to make a first call or obligated you to wait to receive one, how long after a first meeting it was proper to call, how many visits were appropriate before a relationship could be considered established. Getting any of this wrong was not merely awkward, it was a signal. It told the person whose card tray you had incorrectly filled exactly where you had come from, and where, therefore, you belonged. Mourning was another system of this kind, and it was one in which the Victorian period, under the particular influence of the Queen herself, developed an elaboration that bordered on the obsessive. When Prince Albert died in December of 1861, Victoria entered a state of grief that she made no attempt to contain or moderate for public consumption. She dressed in black. She withdrew from society. She continued to dress in black for the rest of her life, for the remaining 4 decades of her reign, so that an entire generation grew up knowing the Queen primarily as a small, solid figure in permanent funereal black, photographed always in the same dark clothes, the same widow's cap, the same expression of settled, satisfied, almost proprietorial grief. This royal example was not merely personal, it set the standard, and the standard, as filtered through the etiquette manuals and the social expectations of the period, was elaborately codified. A widow was expected to observe full mourning for approximately 2 years. Dull black crape fabric, not the glossy silk that might otherwise be worn, because gloss was cheerful and crape was not, because the texture itself was a statement. Jet jewellery, the hard, black, fossilised wood mined from the cliffs near Whitby in Yorkshire, carved into brooch and bracelet and necklace to allow the mourning woman to be decorated without appearing to take pleasure in decoration. Black-bordered stationery for all correspondence, a mourning seal for letters, black-edged visiting cards. After the 2 years of full mourning, a period of half-mourning was observed. Greys and mauves and lavenders, colours that acknowledged the world was beginning to return, but had not yet fully done so. The gradations of mourning, how long for a husband, how long for a father, how long for a cousin of a particular degree of relationship, were as precisely calibrated as anything in Debrett's. And the commercial infrastructure that had grown up to support these gradations was enormous. The great mourning warehouses of London, the establishments that sold nothing but goods appropriate to the bereaved, from the crape yardage to the jet earrings to the black-bordered paper, were substantial businesses. Jay's of Regent Street was famous. Peter Robinson had a mourning department. Death was an industry, and its industry was itself a class signal. The family that could afford the full complement of mourning dress and accessories was demonstrating through its grief that it had the income and the social awareness to grieve correctly. The family that could not was demonstrable in its inadequacy at the very moment it was most exposed. Table manners were the rituals most likely to be encountered across class lines, at dinner parties, at the tables of employers, at the meals that marked social occasions, and they were, correspondingly, the rituals most carefully weaponized against the outsider. The change from service à la Française to service à la Russe is a small piece of culinary history that contains a large social meaning. Service à la Française, the older system, involved placing all the dishes on the table simultaneously, or in large group courses so that the whole table was covered with food, and the diners helped themselves or were helped from the nearest dish. It was convivial and abundant, and relatively forgiving, because you could not easily be watched too closely when the table was covered with things. Service à la Russe, which had arrived in England by mid-century and had become the fashionable norm by the later Victorian period, was entirely different. In this system, the dishes came one at a time, served by footmen moving around the table in sequence, each diner being served individually in turn from each dish. The food arrived in a fixed order of courses: soup, fish, entree, main, game, dessert, ices, and with each course came the question of which utensil. The Victorian formal dinner table was laid with an array of specialised implements that would perplex a guest who had not been taught what each one was for. There were fish knives and fish forks whose shapes were different from the meat knives and forks. There were various spoons of graduated sizes for soups and desserts. There were specialist glasses for each wine, and the wines arrived in a fixed sequence corresponding to the courses. The finger bowl arrived after certain courses and required a specific and unhurried response. The whole performance demanded either training or an extremely convincing imitation of it, and service à la Russe, by serving individually and sequentially, gave every other person at the table a clear view of what you were doing and when. This was not an accident. The elaborate dinner was, among other things, a test, and the forms of address were another such test, perhaps the most immediately exposed of all, because you had to get it right the first time you opened your mouth. The peerage had titles, and the titles had precise forms. A duke was addressed as Your Grace in writing and in speech, not Your Lordship. That was for lesser peers. Not Sir. That was for a knight or baronet. Your Grace. A marquess, an earl, a viscount, a baron were all addressed as My Lord in speech and Your Lordship in formal written address. The wives took their form from their husbands, and the children of peers had their own forms that varied by the rank of the father and the precise degree of the kinship. And then there were the finer distinctions that the outsider was almost certain to miss. Lady Mary Cavendish and Lady Cavendish were not interchangeable. If a woman was an earl's daughter, born into the peerage, the daughter of an earl, she was Lady Mary, with her first name following the title. If she was a knight's wife, married into a lesser courtesy, she was Lady Cavendish, surname only, no first name, because the title attached to the husband's surname, not to her birth name. Getting this wrong was not merely an error of form, it was a revelation of your ignorance of the structure of rank itself, an ignorance that no amount of money or professional achievement could conceal. The distinction between Lady Mary and Lady Cavendish encoded in the simplest possible test whether you had been raised inside the world of the titled or merely arrived at its edges from somewhere else. And so the system held, not through law. England had no formal caste system, no legal prohibition on a tradesman calling himself a gentleman, no statute preventing the daughter of a mill owner from dancing at the same ball as a marquess's niece. The law was formally indifferent to these distinctions. What the law left untouched, the rituals managed. The calling card told you who was receiving whom. The mourning dress told you who observed the code and to what standard. The table manners told you who had been raised at a proper table. The form of address told you who knew the world well enough to speak correctly within it. And, underlying all of it, the clothing, the exact cut of the coat, the quality of the linen, the correctness of the hat for the occasion, the presence or absence of a collar on a working day, told you before a word was spoken in which region of the ladder the person before you had learned to live. What is remarkable, looking back at this system from the distance of many generations, is not how rigid it was, but how anxious it made so many of the people within it. The aristocrat at the summit felt relatively little of this anxiety because his position was given, not earned, and the performance required to maintain it was so deeply habitual that it barely registered as performance at all. It was simply manner, simply how one moved through the world. The anxiety belonged, in its most acute form, to the people in the middle, and most acutely of all, to the people at the lower edges of the middle, the ones who had recently climbed out of something and had not yet climbed far enough to feel secure. The clerk in his terraced house in Holloway, the shopkeeper who had retired from behind the counter and was reinventing himself as a gentleman of leisure, the solicitor's wife who monitored with a precision that her husband perhaps did not fully appreciate every social encounter for signs that the family was being received at the level it deserved. These were the people for whom the system was most consuming. The collar was their armor and their anxiety at once. The evening dinner was their daily performance and their daily proof. The parlour kept for best was both a genuine pride and a constant reminder of how much rested on maintaining it. And below them, the people at the very bottom, the paupers in the workhouse, the mudlarks on the Thames foreshore, the pure finders and the toshers and the crossing sweepers, were in a different relationship with the system entirely. They were not climbing it. They were, for the most part, simply surviving outside it, in the vast space below the lowest rung that the ladder's designers had thought to label. The system was not built for them. The rituals that policed each rung had no version for the person with no rung to stand on. What they had instead was the terror of the workhouse, the place that the system had designed, explicitly and without apology, to be worse than anything the free world could offer, so that no one would choose it who had any other choice at all. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 and its principle of less eligibility was not a failure of imagination. It was a statement of values, a statement about what the society believed the poor deserved and what it believed the middle and upper rungs owed to the rungs below. The answer, made concrete in the separated families and the coarse uniforms and the gruel and the bone-crushing, was very little and even that contingent on suffering for it. You could climb the ladder in Victorian England, people did. A child born in a rookery could, by a combination of luck and intelligence and grinding labour and the right connections at the right moment, end up a clerk or a shopkeeper, or even, in rare and celebrated cases, something above that. The stories were told because they were inspiring and because they were exceptional. They were told too because the system needed the story of its own permeability, the idea that the ladder was open to anyone with the will to climb it. The story was true often enough to be credible. It was not true often enough to be typical. What was typical was the rung you were born on. And what was typical, if you were lucky enough to have a rung to stand on, was the effort required to stay there, to not slip, to keep the collar clean and the parlour ready and the servant in her uniform and the dinner served at the correct hour by the correct name, to watch the rituals and perform them correctly and never, if you could help it, betray by a single gesture or a single mispronounced title or a single misapplied fork that you were not entirely, completely, effortlessly at home, exactly where you stood. The Victorian class system was a ladder built from anxiety, and the higher you climbed, the further there was to fall, and the longer you had been there, the less you felt it at all. There is something both terrible and quietly human about that. The terror belonged to the people in the middle, the ones striving, the ones watching, the ones performing. The ease belonged to the people at the top, who had forgotten, if they had ever known, what the performance cost. And the people at the bottom had neither the terror of falling nor the ease of arrival, only the daily arithmetic of survival. The low tide on the Thames foreshore, the dock gates in the early morning, the bones that had to be crushed, the gruel that had to be eaten, the cold that was simply the cold. The ladder is gone now, or rather, it has been rebuilt so many times in so many different materials that it is no longer recognizable as the same structure. But the anxiety it generated, the watching, the calibrating, the constant monitoring of signal and register, and the fear of betrayal by a single small detail, that is a more durable thing. You can find it in almost any hierarchical system, in any era, in almost any place where people are sorted by invisible criteria into visible categories and told, without being told, that the sorting matters enormously. In Victorian England, the sorting was simply conducted with unusual precision, and the instruments it used, the collar, the card, the word dinner, the angle of the servant's eyes against the wall, were instruments of extraordinary delicacy in the hands of a society that had spent centuries perfecting them. The fires are banked now. The house is quiet. Somewhere in the dark, in a terraced street in Holloway, or in a great house in the counties, or in a single rented room above a raucous costermonger's stall, the day has ended and the Victorian world has settled into its peculiar stillness. Let it be still. If you find yourself drifting through these hours with this kind of company, the long, slow stories, the rooms and streets and lives of another time, there are more waiting for you here, of the same unhurried kind. And if you feel moved to leave a word before you sleep, I would genuinely like to know where in the world you are resting tonight. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.